Hello, my name is Emmeline Jones, and I am an anthropology student at the University of California, Berkeley. So for my final project in my paleopathology class, I wanted to do a presentation on the topic of Neanderthal skeletal trauma. So first off, what is paleopathology? Paleopathology is the study of any bodily abnormalities like disease, trauma, cultural modifications, with reference to their origins, evolution, and prevalence in past human populations. So just who were these ancient people, the Neanderthals? Homo neanderthalensis was a species of hominid first uncovered in 1856 in Neander Valley, Germany. That's the name. These people lived from 400,000 years ago until about 40,000 years ago when they disappeared. So they endured as a people for around 350,000 years. In comparisons, Homo sapiens, us, arose 300,000 years ago and still exists today, although we need to be really careful in the coming years if we want to continue that way. So, however, as Homo neanderthalensis interbred with Homo sapiens of the time, their DNA does live on in us. Neanderthals were also the first fossil hominid that was discovered and given a name. So Neanderthals' range extended from parts of Asia and the Middle East all the way to Germany and Italy, the UK, and the Iberian Peninsula. So contrary to popular belief, Neanderthals were not specifically a cold-dwelling people. In fact, they lived through more interglacials than glacials and even lived through one of the warmest periods in human history, warmer than today, the Eemian. And also contrary to popular belief, Neanderthals were far from stupid. They had sophisticated tool technologies and cultures, art, cooperative societies, and even music. Homo sapiens and Neanderthals are far more similar to each other than different, as also shown by our ability and the fact that we did interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So to give you a better idea of some of the key differences between Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis, here is a handy little anatomy basics comparison. So morphologically, humans and Neanderthals did have some differences. Overall, Neanderthals were shorter and stockier than us, with thicker bones and more muscle attachments. They lacked a chin, had a barrel chest, occipital bun, and a distinctive gap behind their last molar that Homo sapiens do not have. This robust anatomy was quite useful for their strenuous lives. Like Homo sapiens of the time, Neanderthals were hunters of megafauna and small game alike, as well as tool makers, fire wielders, travelers, deep sea divers, craftsmen, musicians, and more. And so here we have a side-by-side skull comparison of Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens. So some of the key differences that we talked about, you can see here with the more like upright skull of the human or the Homo sapien, as well as the nice curved cranium here. Whereas with the Neanderthal, you can see a very robust brow ridge and then a more slanted back, curved or slanted back cranium that's elongated. And there's like barely a forehead. And then we have this big occipital bun back here. And you can see that that's pretty much like absent in the Homo sapiens. You can also see the really robust mandible and then the lack of chin. In fact, Homo sapiens are the only hominid or primate past or present that have a chin. So a little fun fact for you. And then here's some facial reconstructions that I really like. This is the Neanderthal man and Homo sapiens person or Homo sapiens man. And here's just a close-up of those two skulls. So I feel like if you just found one and you were just like a layperson, one or the other, you probably wouldn't be able to tell right off the bat if it was Neanderthal or human. But when they're side by side, you can really tell the difference, as well as the overall larger size of the Neanderthal skull. Even though they were shorter, their heads were actually larger. And then here's a couple more facial reconstructions, this time of the females. This is a Neanderthal woman reconstruction. And here we have the Homo sapien female. And here is a nice frontal view of a Neanderthal with half the facial reconstruction and half the underlining skull that was used as a model. All right, so let's debunk some common myths and stereotypes about Neanderthals. Firstly, it was and unfortunately still is considered that Neanderthals were less intelligent and capable than Homo sapiens of the time. However, there really is no indication for this, and the idea that they lived super difficult and brutish lives in comparison also holds no real ground. In this study below, for example, the authors who looked at a comparative sample of Homo sapiens and Neanderthals found that the same rates of cranial trauma existed in both and the same kinds. So here's a quote from them. We show that Neanderthals and early Upper Paleolithic anatomically modern humans exhibit similar overall incidences of cranial trauma, which are higher for males in both taxa, consistent with patterns shown by later populations of modern humans. So pretty similar in the past and then pretty similar in more of the future. And then here is an early depiction, a really early depiction of what a Neanderthal would have looked like reconstructed back in the day. And we know now that they do not look like that. They don't have an opposable big toe, and they do in fact walk upright, and we don't think they were covered in hair like this one is showed. And then another myth that I touched on earlier is the idea that Neanderthals' bodies were specifically adapted to live in cold environments and they're often associated with the Ice Age. But as I said earlier, just like Homo sapiens, they were adaptable and dwelled in a variety of environments and climates, and Neanderthals actually mostly avoided truly Arctic conditions. And if they were still around today, they may have been quite similar to you and I. I love these reconstructions of Neanderthals in modern clothing, so I had to include them. These are some of the case studies that we will go through in the rest of this presentation. So first up, we have trauma patterns. So while it's true that the skeletal remains of Neanderthals that we have unearthed often bear quite a number of traumas, especially to the head and neck and past humans as well, so too do the skeletal remains of Homo sapiens that existed alongside them. These injuries are thought to mostly be associated with the dangers of living in caves and megafauna encounters and hunting accidents, as well as accidental injuries and interpersonal or with other human groups violence. And so this is the study that I pulled this information from, and then a nice little artistic reconstruction of Neanderthals hunting mammoths. And another picture from that study, we have a table documenting the pathologies of the skeletal remains of 17 Neanderthals. So you can see the name of the specimen, the sex that they ascribed to it, and then the specific kind of bone, and then what the pathology was to that bone. So it was really useful in figuring out what other case studies to choose. All right, so we also must keep in mind that pathological or trauma-bearing skeletal remains are usually given more attention than the non-pathological or trauma-bearing individuals. So we're going to look at the different stuff because it's cooler. And then this is just a little article from the Paleoanthropology journal about just how the myth of them like being way more living way more dangerous lives than Homo sapiens of the time just really isn't what the evidence shows, but I do think this area is in need of more study, and it would be useful to go more in depth in comparing skeletal traumas, as in below the neck of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. All right, so let's meet Shanadar 1. Shanadar 1 was found at a site in Shanadar, Iraq in 1957. He's dated between 45,000 and 35,000 years old, and his age at the time of his death is estimated to be between 34 and 45 years old. So the paleopathologies that he bears are to his skull, he sustained a crushing blow to the left side of his head when he was younger. It healed, but potentially left him blind or visually impaired in that left eye. And it's also thought that it may have caused damage to his brain. And he also has bilateral auditory exostosis. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but it's basically sort of benign growth on the outside of the ear, the skull, and is indicative of a hearing impairment. So his teeth are extremely worn down in a pattern consistent with lifetime use of his teeth as a tool. And to his right arm, he has a very withered right humerus, which has the complete obliteration of the distal head. And below that, his arm was amputated from that point down. And possibly in his adolescence, it was definitely far earlier in his life. And to one of his feet, he has a healed fracture of the right metatarsal, and it's very likely that he would have limped. But it's important to remember that Shannon 1 healed from all these injuries, and none were the cause of his death. Cause of death is historically very tricky to figure out. Shannon 1's survival from all these conditions does mean that in all likelihood, he would have required the care of other hominids to overcome them. So here's some photos of Shannon 1's pathologies. Here you can see the really worn down teeth and the distinctive wear of using the teeth as a tool, most likely of like clenching hide in them while you scrape it. And then here you can see Shannon 1's humeri. We have the left one, which is normal, and then the right one you can see is super thin and withered, which means he probably wasn't using it much. And then it's completely gone from that point down. So amputated. Super fascinating. Here we have the location of Shannon in Iraq on the map, as well as another fun reconstruction of what he may have looked like in life. Again, artistic interpretation, but I really like to show these. And then over here, here we have some of these arrows pointing to the different arthritic lesions and healed fractures of his foot. And then here's just a different look at his skull. So another Shannon find, this is Shannon 3. Shannon 3 was also found at the site in Iraq in 1957 and dated between 45,000 and 35,000 years old, thought to be between 40 and 50 years old at the time of death. And stature, they know for this one, was 5'6", which is pretty tall for a Neanderthal. Paleo Pathology is overall lots of osteoarthritis, and we'll go over in a little bit what exactly that is. And then teeth worn down almost completely to the roots. And the axial skeleton, which is the torso of your body and the neck and head, he has a stab wound to the chest, injuring the 9th rib and possibly his lung. And then this is the site of Shannon Cave, which I thought was nice to see what it looks like today, of course. All right, so here's a photo of the rib puncture right here. This is a partially healed fracture, likely from a projectile weapon with low kinetic energy like a spear or knife. Based on the level of bone healing, whereby new bone is being laid down over the defect, Shannon 3 survived for at least 2 weeks afterward, but likely longer. So it takes bone, usually you see bone healing on a skeletal specimen visible between 2 to 3 weeks after an injury. So we know he lived longer than that afterwards. He had very thick bones with robust muscle attachments. Again, right there, thinking that he was male, which you can see this arrow pointing to just the really thick part of this bone here. This is indicative of leading a highly active life. So thinking about things he possibly did, maybe building things, carrying wood and carcasses, digging, maybe carrying young or elderly, stuff like that. And then this is the scientific paper I read about the rib puncture wound. And this study was really interesting because the authors actually tried to figure out how and what caused Shannon 3's rib fracture by using different weapons and playing out different scenarios in real life using animal carcasses. So they concluded that the perpetrator was likely right-handed and the weapon was probably either a spear or a knife. And this is a stone tool. This is before the time of metal. They also highlight that this injury could have been intentional, as in like warfare, interpersonal conflict, but it also could have been an accident while hunting. But sadly, we will never know for sure unless we figure out how to time travel. And here's a photo of Shannon 3's talus, which is part of the ankle, that suffered a fracture earlier in life. And they think that because of that fracture, he developed a lot of osteoarthritic growth on that talus, which you can see the arrows pointing to. And this is a little definition of osteoarthritis from the CDC. Osteoarthritis is the most common form of arthritis. Some people call it degenerative joint disease or wear and tear arthritis. With OA, the cartilage within a joint begins to break down and the underlying bone begins to change. These changes usually develop slowly and get worse over time. It can cause pain, stiffness, and swelling. In some cases, it also causes reduced function and disability. Some people are no longer able to do daily tasks or work. So we can't go back and ask him what his level of pain was like and what level of functioning he had. So it's all a lot of like inference based on what we know today, thinking about what that would have been like. All right, so this is a really interesting part of this lecture, Megafauna Encounters. So life for Neanderthals was not easy, and one of the dangers they would have dealt with was megafauna. So these are large mammals that once lived alongside past hominids. We know that they had these encounters based on the archaeological record, and the evidence includes cave paintings, hunting implements embedded in megafauna bone, and injuries to Neanderthal bodies themselves. Hunting large megafauna such as mammoths and bison was especially hazardous. Looking at carnivorous megafauna, based on the pattern of injuries, one can figure out what kind of carnivore a past person had an encounter with, as shown in the study by Camaros, Edgar et al., which was really interesting. Basically, they can figure out if it was a bear or a lion that attacked you, because like bears will tend to go for the outer limbs and cats and dogs tend to go for the neck of their victim. All right. And so while Neanderthals did have a diet that included a variety of plant foods throughout time, hunting and fishing were undeniably a vital component of life for them, with animals providing food, tools, clothing, and even housing. And here's a cool reconstruction of what one of those housing types might have looked like, made of mammoth bones and tusks and hide. And here are some examples of just a handful of the megafauna that existed in Eurasia during the time of Neanderthals. You'll notice that everything is quite large. It's been absolutely amazing to see. Maybe not so amazing if you had to deal with them every day. Here we have an auroch and saber-toothed cat, Irish giant deer, giant polar bear, as in like a polar bear today, but bigger. We have the steppe mammoth and cave hyenas, which yes, were in Eurasia, even though today they only are in Africa. All right, so here is La Faraise. La Faraise was found in a cave in La Faraise, France in 1909. I also may be pronouncing that totally wrong, but yeah. So they dated them between 70,000 and 50,000 years old, and the age at time of death was about 50 to 60 years old, so a very old individual. Paleo pathology for this one is slanted tooth wear, also indicative of using teeth as tools. Lots of fractures, total of 29 specimens from this individual had fractures, and you can see it included the cranium, the long bones, and other postcranial remains. Some are post-depositional, which means that it happened after this person died and was buried and covered over, but some would have happened throughout their life. So a traumatic lesion to the left clavicle, likely a green stick fracture, also exists, and to the greater trochanter of the right femur was likely an avulsion fracture. And La Faraise 1 also had scoliosis, which is very interesting. And La Faraise, it's very possible that he would have needed his food ground up and processed in order to eat it. And La Faraise is considered a classic Neanderthal man with a good display of sexual dimorphism, as seen by his very large brow ridge and overall large size. All right, and here we have Saint Césaire 1. So Saint Césaire 1 was found in a collapsed rock shelter in La Roche-et-Perrot, France, unearthed in 1979. It's dated to about 36,000 years ago and is a young adult, possibly male. So paleopathology for this one is a healed cranial fracture, which was relatively mild and from a sharp trauma injury. He survived at least several months after obtaining this, and this injury was unlikely as cause of death. And this injury was likely caused by a blow from above, like from an implement like a stone blade, like this little GIF in the corner here. And they think it's pretty good. The authors of this paper think there's pretty good evidence that it was interpersonal conflict that caused St. Cicerone's injuries. All right, moving on, the Spy Cave Neanderthals. So the Spy Cave Neanderthals 1 and 2 were found in Spy Cave, Belgium, excavated in 1885 and 1886. They're dated to between 41,000 and 36,000 years ago. Spy 1 is thought to be an adult female, and Spy 2 is actually DNA confirmed to be a young male. So the paleopathology for these guys are massive blows to the tops and sides of their skulls, which likely occurred at the same time and around their deaths. So it's thought that they might have been caught in a rock fall, or maybe it's indicative of interpersonal conflict. We can't be sure about this, as since they were excavated a long time ago, proper protocol wasn't followed very well, and its context is super disturbed, and none of the fallen remains are in association with them anymore. All right, so here's a close-up of Spy 2's cranial injuries, as well as a reconstruction of what Spy 2 might have looked like over here. Moving on, we have Crepina 34.7. This individual was unearthed at the Crepina rock shelter in Croatia. And the Crepina site has yielded the actually largest number of human skeletal remains from the Upper Pleistocene. And many of the remains here exhibit antemortem, which means before death, fracturing. This individual is dated at around 130,000 years ago, and the paleopathology of Crepina 34.7, the most serious of which is a skull wound, it's the most serious skull wound found on any hominid. It's very severe and has a large circular depressed fracture on this parietal bone fragment here. It shows considerable healing though, so even though this was such a massive injury, the individual survived for some time after. This injury is rather unusual in its roundness and lack of radiating fractures, but it's difficult to determine probable cause without any more of the skull. Was it a high-speed blow? Possibility of trepanation has also not been ruled out, that maybe this person suffered a blow to the head and then individuals tried to help them relieve the pressure in the skull by trepanating. But there just isn't enough evidence to actually look into that more. The most likely explanation for this injury, according to the authors that I referenced here, is that it might have been an accident associated with living in caves, so falling rocks from above, and these could have been really heavy and really devastating when they hit you. And then the depressed skull fracture is a specific kind of injury whereby a piece of the skull is actually broken off and pushed in towards the brain, and it could cause pretty severe defects to the individual. So obviously there's so much that we don't know about Neanderthals and so much left to be investigating. How they lived, so much left to be investigated. How they lived, what they made, what obstacles they faced, and how they died. With the thawing of the permafrost we are now experiencing, it is very possible that we may one day find the body of a Neanderthal rather than just skeletal remains. I can only imagine just how remarkable that would be. And I've included more of my favorite artistic reconstructions. These are by Tom Bjorklund, really cool artist that reconstructs past people and animals. So I included some photos of them there. So again, Neanderthals are more like us than not. And if you're interested in learning more about this sister species of ours, Kindred is one of my favorite books about them. And I'll end with a quote from the author. Rebecca Ragg Sykes writes, "Look through the shadows, listen beyond echoes. They have much to tell, not only of other ways to be human, but new eyes to see ourselves. The most glorious thing about the Neanderthals is that they belong to all of us, and they're no dead end past tense phenomenon. They are right here in my hands typing and your brain understanding my words. Thanks for watching, and here are a couple slides showing my sources.